So the Gemara that we learned on Friday was the Gemara starting with this Mishnah that person who builds a sukkah under a tree, it's not valid. And the Gemara had explained that to mean that depends what type of a tree. It has to be a tree that has a lot of branches. That's when it's invalid. But if it was just chamsay meruba mitzilasa, if it was just a small amount of branches, be okay. It's not considered like a real entity that it's going to invalidate the the sukkah that's below it. And of course, that creates a question because the Mishnah didn't clarify that. That's someone in the Gemara, a rabbi from the Gemara, mentioning this. It's quite a well, the Gemara wants to figure out exactly what the case is, and then we'll find out what exactly is he innovating. And is that something very innovative? Is this law something new that we would not have known, or is it obvious? And the Gemara initially says, so what's the source of this? And the Gemara says, well, you see it from the source is the fact that the Mishnah used the words ki'ilu asa b'seicha bayis. The Mishnah adds words. The Mishnah says things that could have just simply said invalid. The Mishnah says, no, you build a sukkah under a tree. It doesn't say it's invalid. It says it's as if you built it in a house. I mean, that's almost like playing games a little with us. I could have just said it straight out, black and white. Is it invalid, or is it valid or not? So no, it's as if you built it inside the house. So why does the Mishnah come and tell us that? Because it's adding this point. In other words, so Rava is basing this law that it's hinted to, and he's telling us it's really hinted to in the Mishnah because the Mishnah uses the words it's ki'ilu asa b'seicha bayis. It means it has to be similar to a house. A house is a majority shade. Of course, a roof is supposed to give you shade, and therefore, if you have a sukkah that's under a tree and the tree is not giving you so much shade, it wouldn't be a problem. So, so the Gemara says that if it is not giving you that much shade, it still should ruin your sukkah. Like, what's the logic behind it? So now we have a hint in the Mishnah. That's good. You've proven your point from the Mishnah. Now explain it. Why that reason? The reason for such a law. Why should this be okay? So, in other words, the Mishnah, it seems to hint it. Okay, we got a hint from the Mishnah, but logically, that doesn't sound like that should be the rule. Logically, the rule should be that it's invalid. It's you have non-kosher schach there. Now, we explained on Friday that Tosfos and seemingly Rashi does seem to say this as well. Tosfos spells it out very clearly that we're dealing with a case where you're utilizing the non-kosher schach to validate your sukkah because your sukkah doesn't have enough kosher schach. So you're including the non-kosher schach with your kosher schach in calling the rule batel, utilizing the rule of batel beroiv, that it becomes nullified in the majority and trying to use the non-kosher schach for the for to be counted as schach. And so the Gemara is basically not only asking how could you have non-kosher schach on your sukkah, but it's really asking much stronger. How could you validate your sukkah with non-kosher schach? How could your non-kosher schach be used as a means to add schach to your insufficient amount of schach that you have until now? How can you use the non-kosher to make it sufficient? So that strengthens really the question, the way Rashi and Tosfos are learning it. Again, there is another way of learning the Rav Yod that is brought down another Rishonim that the simple meaning of the Gemara, as you would simply read it, is simply you have non-kosher schach there. How could it be a kosher sukkah? So that also is one of the explanations here. But Rashi and Tosfos seem to add this additional point that you're even using the non-kosher schach to make your sukkah kosher. So how could that be? How could that be okay? And the Gemara's answer is b'shachavta. Chavtan, you lowered it. You connected it with the other schach. You included it into the other schach, and therefore it's going to be not only not going to ruin your sukkah, but according to Rashi and Tosfos, you're actually validating your sukkah with it. And to the extent that the Gemara says, if it's chavtan, obviously it's kosher. Why would you even think that it's not kosher? That's quite a I know the Gemara is saying, even though according to Rashi and Tosfos, you're koshering your sukkah with this non-kosher schach, the Gemara says that's obvious that it's going to work. It's obvious. Chavton. You connected it together. If you connected it together with the other schach, I mean, that's all you need. It makes it kosher. You've koshered your sukkah. Now, I did see one of the commentaries explain why is it so obvious. It's based on another Mishnah that we're going to learn that makes it obvious that when you mix it together, when it's that it would be considered a kosher sukkah. So, in other words, based on that Mishnah, which the Gemara brings, the Hidla Allah Sagefen, that the Gemara brings shortly, and then we're going to see it later in the Mishnah as well. We're going to see it later that that there is such a concept of chavtan, or that it's mixed, that it's lowered and mixed with the other schach. So the Gemara here says this is an obvious law, and why would the Mishnah even have to tell us this, even in a hint? Like the Mishnah shouldn't have even hinted it, because it's an obvious law. And the Gemara answers, well, you might have thought that we should make a gzeira. We should make a decree, because there are possibly going to be a person who's going to make a mistake, and he'll think that you could even use non-kosher schach even if it wasn't lowered and mixed with the other schach. And that was the Gemara's explanation. Now the Gemara then asks, we also have a source for that, because there's this other Mishnah that we didn't learn yet, but we're going to be learning later, page 11, where it says that if you drew the vine or the dalas, the gourd, some other type of kisam, I think we translated as ivy, if I'm not mistaken. Was that the translation, David? Kisam? Kisos?
Yeah, I think that was it. Yeah.
It was ivy. So in any event, it's some type of a branch, some type of vegetation that grows, and you pulled it, and it's attached to the ground, and you pulled it on top of the sukkah. So generally it'll be puzzle, but if you have much more kosher schach, or you cut it, so it'll be kosher. And the case was that it's non-kosher. It's normally non-kosher, but if you have more kosher schach than it'll be batal, it'll become nullified. So the Gemara says, so the understanding is that must be talking about a case of chavtan, where you mixed it together. So we see that when you lower it, mix it together, it's not going to ruin your sukkah. And the Gemara's the Gemara's answer is that, yeah, you do see it there as well. That's true. You do have another source for this, that chavtan, it makes it kosher. And we don't make such a decree that maybe someone is going to not be chavtan, not lower non-kosher schach, and if he doesn't lower it, mix it, then it's really not kosher, and someone might make a mistake even when he did mix it, but that so therefore we should prohibit even if he does lower it and mix it. And my answer is yeah. So we have one the Mishnah says it's kosher. Our Mishnah tells us that you're even allowed to do it in the first place. Knows you could build your sukkah that way, and it's not a problem because it's such a because the sukkah is under a tree that doesn't have a lot of branches. You would even be allowed to put your sukkah there in the first place as long as you're chavtan, and we're not afraid in a case where you might not be chavtan. So you're even allowed to do it in the first place and initiate your sukkah that way, and it's not a problem. I'm going to read it inside. I don't know if we actually read the last little paragraph, so I'll go over it inside.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
just a quick question.
yeah.
When we were talking about you can't build a sukkah under a tree, so I forget if we talked about this or not. What about you build a sukkah where there's no tree and the tree grows, and now it's under the tree, but it wasn't there when you built the sukkah?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The simple understanding I would say is that it should be the same law, but you read something in your notes a while a few days ago that something about there's a difference between if it's before or after. Do you remember mentioning that?
I have something
You
here.
read some
Yeah.
note, and I was a little surprised, but I guess I really should look it up in Shulchan Aruch maybe if there is such a thing. I didn't think that there was a difference, but I don't know. I didn't want to argue with what. Maybe you have a source. Maybe because you read something in the beginning about something about a difference between before or after.
There is something here. It's a large paragraph. Should I just share it so you
Okay,
can
yeah,
look at it?
okay,
Okay,
yeah.
let me
Maybe
do
we'll
this
see the
here.
source.
Okay. Is that working?
Yeah, okay. A sukkah beneath a tree whose shade is minimal. Um, mm. If a sukkah is established beneath a tree whose sunlight exceeds its shade, and the shade of the sukkah is greater than its sunlight, some are of the opinion that it is fit and nothing further is required. However, if the sunlight of the sukkah is greater than its shade and is only the shade provided by the tree that causes the shade in the sukkah to exceed the sunlight, one must lower the branches of the tree, interweave them with the fit roofing of the sukkah so that they will not be discernible. Others say that even if the sukkah is fit and its shade exceeds its sunlight, if the branches of the tree are directly above the fit roofing, they render the sukkah unfit. Others say that even if the sukkah is fit and its shade exceeds its sunlight, but if the branches of the tree are directly above the fit roofing, they render the sukkah unfit. However, if one interwove the branches of the tree into the roofing of the sukkah is fit. In addition, if the branches are not directly above the fit roofing, the sukkah is fit. The halacha is in accordance with the latter stricter ruling. Okay, although in exigent circumstances, one may rely on the lenient opinion. Okay, that wasn't the note that you had read before. I'll just I'll just bring it from the Shulchan Aruch because I see here in the Shulchan Aruch I have a Mishnah Berurah in front of me. You can close the share screen, David. I think
Okay.
you had quoted something else before because that's not really adding. We sort of spoke out those. We mentioned those two opinions. Now, in the Shulchan Aruch, it's in the Mishnah Berurah, the Beis Yosef, the Chaber, Rabbi Yosef Kaira writes, um, he brings over here that some say that even if the sukkah, so he brings that thing. So this is chapter 626. It says, "Don't build a sukkah under a house or a tree. Person who builds a sukkah under a tree, some say that if the tree is more shade than sunlight, it's puzzle in all cases. Puzzle in all cases, even if the sukkah also has shade, more shade than sunlight. But if the tree um, But if the tree is more sunlight than shade, then you have this machlokes, right? The Rashi, the way Rashi and Taisus learn, or the other, or the Ravya. So the Shulchan Aruch says if the sukkah has a sufficient schach without the tree, then for sure it's kosher. Then it's kosher, even if you didn't lower the branches to mix them with the sukkah with the schach. But if the sukkah doesn't have enough shade, only through it the tree, then you have to lower the branches and mix them together, and the schach will be majority. And some say even if the sukkah has sufficient schach without the tree, and the tree is insufficient schach, because in other words, the tree is more sun than shade. So if the branches are exactly above the schach that's kosher, then it would be puzzle. Whether the tree was before the sukkah or whether the sukkah was before the tree. Now, if you lowered the branches and mixed them with the schach, the sukkah will be kosher. And if you put schach kosher on top of the schach puzzle, it's called mixed and it's kosher. And if the branches are in the area of space that's open, that there's no kosher schach there, and that's where you have it. You have the non-kosher schach, so it'll be kosher, since the sale of the kosher is majority over the sunlight. And even if you would take the tree away, it would be enough kosher schach, and this all works. It doesn't make a difference whether the tree is before the schach or not. In other words, it's the same law. So I think the insights of this paragraph of the Shulchan Aruch, we really need to get to one more Gemara before you can really understand the details, because there's a big discussion here about the schach being the tree being on the empty space in between your kosher schach or not. So now we've just learned really a partial rules of this law, but we really need the other half of the rules, and in order to be able to learn this paragraph properly. So we'll come back to this paragraph in the Shulchan Aruch after we learn the other Mishnah. But the difference between being before, if the tree is before or after, it seems pretty clear that it doesn't make a difference. So I don't know, David, I think found some, maybe you'll find that note, and maybe we'll look up where that, maybe there is a specific case that it does make a difference. But the Shulchan Aruch seems to be saying that it shouldn't make a difference. I didn't think logically it should make a difference, but maybe there is some scenario, or if you find that note, David, I'd like to see it. Okay, so getting back to our Gemara, let me read it inside, because I'm not sure if we finished the end piece. So the Gemara, we're going to start Hanami Tanina, which is probably about 13 lines from the top, I'm guessing. No, I'm off. Probably about 20 lines from the top. Hanami Tanina. And if you're in the art scroll, the art scroll would be 9b1, the last paragraph. Okay, so we're just going to do what we just said outside. I'm just going to read it and say, Hanami Tanina, this also was learned in a Mishnah, that if you drew on top of your sukkah the geffen, the vine, the delas, the gourd, or the pumpkin, or Dalas is squash, different translations of Dalas. Ves hakisos, and the kisos is this ivy. So v'sigech al gabon, and you put schach on top of the these items. Psula, it will be puzzle. It'll be it won't be kosher. But if your schach is more than them, and oisha kitzitzan, in other words, you have majority kosher schach, or that you cut those from being attached to a tree, so now they're no longer attached to a tree. Shera, it would be kosher. So that's the Mishnah. In the case of the Mishnah, so Hechi Dami, the Gemara asks, what is that case? What are we talking about? Ilema, Hechi Dami is translated as how is it so? What is the scenario? So the Gemara explains, expounds on this. Ilema, if you want to say b'shalei chavtan, that you didn't lower it and mix it together, hakam etzav schach pasol schach kosher, you are mixing schach pasol, non-kosher schach, with kosher schach, and you're trying to kosher your sukkah with that, and that won't work. You're being masachech with things that are attached to the ground, and it's not going to be a kosher sukkah, because the non-kosher elements are going to ruin your sukkah and not be buttal to the schach. They're not going to be nullified to the kosher schach. So the Gemara answers elalav v'shachavtan. So it must be talking about that you lowered it, mixed them together, and that's why it's going in that scenario. I'll have to call you back. Sorry. Sorry. So the Gemara says that that you're mixing the schach puzzle with the schach kosher. How is that going to be okay? The Gemara answers, it must be that you mix them together, and that's why it's going to be batel. It'll nullify the non-kosher schach. The kosher schach will nullify the non-kosher schach. Ushmamina deloy gazrinon, and we hear from this that you are not geyser. We don't make a decree from the scenario where the schach is mixed together, because what will be in a case where you didn't mix the schach together and lower the non-kosher schach and mix it with the kosher schach. So therefore, you see from that Mishnah that we do not make such a decree, and we say that as long as you have majority kosher schach, it will be able to be nullified. The non-kosher schach is nullified. You see that in that Mishnah. So the Gemara answers that, in other words, and what comes out from this? It comes out that our Mishnah doesn't need to tell us this law, because we have another Mishnah that basically spells it out clearly. And the Gemara concludes and says that Hani Mili B'diavad. Can you hear me, or you hear all the crying? Do you hear the crying behind me? You don't hear any of the crying? Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, everything's
crying.
good.
No crying.
Okay. So the Gemara answers, Hani Mili B'diavad. This is applicable. This would be in the case where it was already done. Then we would say that it's kosher. But to tell you that you would be allowed, preferably in the first case, to do such a thing and make a sukkah with this tree above it and mix the schach together, and lechatchila lo, I would say that you can't do that and mix it together, because we would say a gzeira, a decree, that what's going to happen in a case where you didn't mix it. You might forget to mix it. You might confuse it with mixing it. So the Gemara says, Kamash Malana comes and lets us hear that there's no problem. We don't compare the two cases and make a decree from one to the other. And we say, basically, as long as you're mixing it, lowering your non-kosher schach and mixing it with the kosher schach, that would be okay. So that's basically this piece of Gemara. We're going to soon see it gets a little more complicated here. with the two sukkahs, one on top of the other. This was the case of the sukkah under a tree. Now we're going to jump to the sukkah under another sukkah. Now I think Ezra had asked a question on Friday that regarding like the height, something to do with the difference between what happens if you didn't lower it and you didn't mix it together, what will be. So I want to put that on hold, and I'll tell you why, because our Gemara is going to talk about what to do, sukkah under another sukkah, how much of a difference does there need to be in order to make it considered a sukkah under a sukkah. So it really is going to be discussing a little about that on page Yud, on page 10. And of course, there are some other sugyas, a few other discussions about this on page 15 and on page 22. So it's a little complicated to, that's what's hard about learning sometimes, is because some of the sugyas that you learn, it says Torah is aniyim b'makam echad and ashirim b'makam acher. Torah is poor in one place and rich in another place. So in other words, you sort of need to grab from what it says here and then grab what it says there, and then take the third thing and then combine the three together. And we really need to have the more clarity by mixing all three of these discussions together. And that's why, again, also the Shulchan Aruch was the same thing. It's like it's bringing stuff from a few different sources over there, and we only saw one of the original sources. So, okay, so we're going to continue with the Tana Rabbanan, the Bryce over here on page 9b. And if you're in the art scroll, it must be 9b2. 9b2, the first column, the bottom paragraph on first column, 9b2, and we're going to continue in the next Gemara. Sukkah al gabi sukkah, a sukkah that's on top of a sukkah full, etc. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a brisa. The sukkah is teshvu. It says in the pasuk, Basuka is Teshva. It's interesting that the Gemara uses the double vav. It has two vavs in that word basukais, but the actual pasuk has neither of those vavs. It says basukais Teshvu in sukais without any vav. Teshvu, you should dwell. V'loi basuka shetachas asukah. And the Gemara says, you know what that means? Basukais Teshvu, you should dwell inside a sukkah. It means that you should not dwell in a sukkah under a sukkah. It's only in one sukkah you dwell, not a sukkah that's under a sukkah. And not a sukkah that's under a tree. In other words, if you're dwelling in us, if the Torah is telling you, dwell in a sukkah, it means a single sukkah. It means a sukkah and only a sukkah. You're not dwelling in something else also. You're dwelling in a sukkah, under two sukkahs, dwelling like in two sukkahs, so to speak. Or a sukkah under a tree. So you're dwelling under a tree and under a sukkah. So it basically is saying basukais teshu, dwell in a sukkah and not in these other situations where you're not only under a sukkah, you're under a tree, or you're under another sukkah. And also not a sukkah that's inside a house, that you're only dwelling in a sukkah, not inside a house and in a sukkah. So the Gemara now asks, now what do you mean by saying this teaching if the pasuk says basukais? Basukais in sukkais. Sounds like you could dwell in two sukkahs, and it sounds like it's not only in one sukkah. It says basukais. Adarabah, the Gemara asks. On the contrary, basukais tarti mashma. Basukais, it sounds like two, that you could have two different. You're in two dwellings, and how could you exclude a sukkah that is more than one? That is more than one type of a covering over you, and how could we exclude that? So the Gemara answers that really, what's the words here? The Gemara answers, Amar Rav Nachman, by Yitzchok basukas ksiv. The Gemara answers that even though we're pronouncing it basukais, but really in the pasuk it actually doesn't have those vavs. It only says basukas. So the pronunciation is basukais. You should dwell in a sukkah. But because it's missing the vavs, it could be read basukas. And the way the letters are spelled, the spelling of it is basukas. Now, because it's spelled basukas, we have to darshan it as if it means one sukkah. So one dwelling, and you're not dwelling in a sukkah that's inside a house, a sukkah that's under a sukkah that is under a tree. None of these will work because it says basukas. Now, that goes very good if you hold yesh aim lemasitis. we had before that there's you either follow the way it's spelled or the way it's pronounced. But if you go by the way it's pronounced, Yeshem Lamikra, you could ask, how does this work? I go by the way it's pronounced, and it's pronounced Basukais. And according to my opinion, the Yesh Aim Lamikra, we're supposed to expound the way it's pronounced. And why? How does the Gemara make this almost like a automatic thing? Yesh Aim, where it's sort of concluding that we follow the way it's spelled, which would be Yeshem Lamasidus instead of Yeshem Lamikra. This is supposed to be a machlokes, an argument. And we saw previously, that the Gemara did have a whole discussion about if it's, do we count the basukois, do we count it as if it's the way it's pronounced, and then you have 6 times sukkah, or if you have the way it's spelled, if it's the way it's spelled, it would only be 4 times sukkah, because one of them has the vavs, and one of them, and the others don't. So Taisus over here is bothered with this question. Taisus tells us that even if you hold yesh aim lemikra, that you go by the way it's pronounced, but you also have to acknowledge the fact that it's spelled also has a little hint. Because we prioritize the way it is pronounced, but the way it's spelled, why did the Torah Taka spell it that way? That's also something that deserves to be expounded upon. It's just we put priority, yesh aim limit, but it's not for nothing that it's written in the Messiah, that it's written without the vavs. So it has to be teaching us something. So the Mishnah says that that the law is a sukkah under a tree and a sukkah in a house and a sukkah under a sukkah is not going to be kosher, and that's going to be based on the fact that it's spelled as if it's a single sukkah. Basukas, even though we pronounce it basukais, but it's spelled as if it says basukas. Okay. So now comes the 4 different scenarios. Basically, a sukkah under a sukkah, our Mishnah tells us that the Tanakama holds, the rabbis, which are called the Tanakama, the first opinion in the Mishnah, they hold that it's puzzle, it's invalid, a sukkah under a sukkah. So the Gemara now tells us that it really depends. Yirmiyah comes up with, it says there's 4 scenarios. You could have the sukkah that's under a sukkah that as the Mishnah said, the top one is kosher and the bottom one is puzzle, right? Because your sukkah is under another sukkah, so it's puzzle. If the Yirmiyah says it's really 4 scenarios. You could have them all puzzle, all kosher. The top could be kosher, the bottom puzzle, the top could be puzzle, the bottom one could be kosher. You have 4 different scenarios, and we'll have to explain how they are. So, Amar Reb Yirmiyah. Reb Yirmiyah says, there are times that both are going to be kosher. Both sukkahs, one on top of the other. How could you have that? One sukkah on top of it, so we'll soon see. But you can have 2 sukkahs, one on top of the other. And even though we just said basukas, that it really teaches us that a sukkah under a sukkah is not going to be kosher, but it's possible for it to be kosher. There is a way that it could be kosher. A sukkah under a sukkah, and both could even be kosher. In pa'amim, sometimes sustained psulas, both could be invalid. Even though our Mishnah said the top one is yoinek shera, the top one is kosher, but there is a scenario where the top one would be puzzle and the bottom one would be puzzle. Both are invalid. In pa'amim, sometimes the bottom one could be kosher, while yoinek psula and the top one could be puzzle. That's like the exact opposite of what we would think. It's totally the opposite of logic, and it's the opposite of what the Mishnah says. But you could have the bottom one kosher and the top one puzzle. Pa'amim, and sometimes shetachtain psula, well, yonik shera, and that would be like our Mishnah said, that the bottom one would be puzzle because it's under another sukkah, and the top one would be kosher. Pa'amim, sheshtain psheris, and then you could have both kosher. So you got all these 4 different options here. Heichi dami. That's the question: is how is this so? Kigoin, for example, shetachtaina, the bottom one, is chamsa meruba mitzilasa. The bottom one has more sun than shade. I'm sorry. Let me read this sentence one more time. We already said Rabbi Yirmiyah started with this line. Sometimes the first that the two are kosher, and now the Gemara is explaining it. How is it so that the two could be kosher? Kigoin, for example, that the bottom one has more sun than shade. Well, yoina, and the top one, silsa meruba mechamasa. And the top one has more shade than sun. So, b'kaima el yoina b'seiches. And the top one is within 20 amos. It's within 20 amos. Of course, there's a discussion. Does it mean 20 amos of its floor, or is it 20 amos from the floor from the ground? But we're going to just learn simply that it's within 20 amos of its floor. Its floor has to be within 20 amos of its floor, and therefore the case is going to be that both are going to be kosher. Why are both kosher? So the reason is because we're not going to consider the bottom sukkah a sukkah in its own right, and instead we're going to consider it part of the upper sukkah. Why is the bottom sukkah going to be part of the upper sukkah? Because the bottom sukkah's schach is not really enough schach to make it a kosher sukkah. It's chamsa meruba mitzilas. It has more sun than shade. So the bottom sukkah is not a kosher sukkah, but only to get, if you look at the big picture, look at the big sukkah, then it'll be a kosher sukkah. And we are going to include the top schach to make the bottom to either to join together with the bottom schach to make it kosher, or at least the top schach in its own right is enough, but the bottom schach on its own is not enough, and therefore we're going to consider the top sukkah, the schach on the top sukkah, a kosher sukkah for itself. It's within 20 amos, and the bottom sukkah is not really a sukkah because it's not. It doesn't have chamsa meruba mitzilos. It doesn't have enough shade. So therefore, both sukkahs are going to be kosher. So if you wanted to live in the top one, or you want to go in the bottom one, either one is going to be a valid sukkah. Now, the next case, pa'amim, sometimes sheshtehen psulos, both of them are going to be invalid. What would the case be? If both are, the shade is more than the sunlight. The kaimel yoina l'mayla miyasrim, and the top one is above 20. So if it's above 20 amos, l'mayla miyasrim amma, so that causes that the top sukkah is going to be invalid because it's above 20 amos from its floor. And the bottom sukkah is a sukkah tachas hasukkah. It's considered a sukkah under another sukkah. Why? Because the bottom sukkah is a valid sukkah. So therefore, it's considered to be a sukkah under a sukkah, which we just said from the word basukas, it's going to be invalid. So the top one is invalid because if it's above 20. The bottom one's invalid because it's a sukkah tachas hasukkah. Now comes the third case. Sometimes the bottom one is going to be kosher, and the top one is going to be puzzle. The top one will be invalid. So you have the bottom one is going to be kosher. How could that be? And now we turn to page 10a. How is that so? Going, for example, the bottom one has more shade than sunlight, so that's a kosher sukkah. Except what about the top one? Well, the top one happens to have doesn't have sufficient schach, and therefore it's not considered a sukkah. And v'kaimi tar and both of them are within 20. Both of them are within 20 amos, and therefore it is considered that it is. You could use that schach even for the bottom sukkah. Again, the bottom sukkah is kosher, and we said that the bottom sukkah has sail meruba mechamasa, which means that together with the top sukkah, it's going to have enough sail, enough shade. And the top one has more sun than shade, but together with the bottom one, it's considered enough. It's going to add to the schach of the bottom one. Of course, that in the bottom sukkah, you'll have more shade than sunlight. And they're both within 20 amos. And therefore, since it's within 20 amos, you can use this top sukkah schach to benefit the bottom sukkah. So the top sukkah itself is not really called a sukkah, so it doesn't ruin the bottom sukkah to be called a sukkah under a sukkah. But the top sukkah also doesn't have enough schach, but the schach can be used to benefit the bottom sukkah, and ultimately the bottom sukkah is going to be a kosher sukkah, and the top one won't be a kosher sukkah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
If the top one is puzzle, how can it be called a sukkah if it's on top of another sukkah? I mean, could it be considered even a sukkah? I mean, basically, I mean, if it's
the top one is puzzle, so then the bottom one is not called a sukkah under a sukkah. Correct. You're right. That it's not really a sukkah under a sukkah because the top one's not really a sukkah.
So like it could be like a storage area that people get their whatever they need, But I don't see why they would have I mean, just for shade, for that purpose to add to the lower schach. That's the only reason for having it, But would it be used for storage? I mean, what would they use it for?
What's the practical reason of this whole scenario? Why is he doing this? That's a good question.
Yeah.
Why would anyone do such a thing? Put a sukkah under a sukkah? Yeah, I haven't figured that out really. Why would someone want that? The only thing we thought of in our learning on Friday was maybe if you're in a very urban area where there's no property and you need to fit a lot of people, so you could have a double decker sukkah.
Question.
But it's not so simple because what was the case? Where do you have both sukkahs that are kosher? So what did we say? If they're both kosher, the bottom one doesn't have enough shade, but together with the top one, you'll have enough shade, and they're within 20 amos. So yeah, I guess that could be a scenario if you wanna do it that way. Yeah, yes, Ezra.
Does the top one have a floor?
It seems like the schach is the floor.
But the schach of the bottom one is the floor to the top one?
That's what it seems like.
And when you're saying that you combine the schach, are you saying that you actually take the schach off the top one and put it on the bottom one, or together they when
together
you look
they kosher. Yeah.
One sort of throws shade onto the second one so that it appears to satisfy the requirements.
Yeah, in other words, you have enough. Let's say the area is 8 by 8, so the bottom schach is like 4 by 8. The top schach is 4 by 8. I mean, you definitely have enough. Or it's like two. It's you need majority, so you need to make it 5 by 8 to make it a kosher sukkah. So each one is like 2.5 by 8. So altogether, it's 5 by 8 schach. So you're using the top schach and the bottom schach, and ultimately it's going to give enough schach. It's to shade that your sukkah has shade, and majority there's a majority amount of schach there that's shade. Probably you could even get away with half and half, because if there's half and half schach, then that means automatically it's more shade than sun. That's the rule. So really it could be 4, but yeah. So if you have 2 by 8 and 2 by 8, if each sukkah has 2 by 8, that should be enough to make it majority shade.
Okay, another question. When you're saying sukkah over here, you're actually meaning the walls and the roof. It doesn't mean that an individual can actually be physically in there, because if you're talking about the person in the top sukkah using the schach of the bottom sukkah as a floor, that would be extremely precarious for anybody to be in there. I mean, if we build it the same way we do now, where you use mats, let's say up on top, or even if you were to put in palm fronds, that surface is not strong enough to hold somebody's weight.
Right, right. We're not encouraged. We definitely don't think that someone should use this. I would my understanding would be this would be a case where you're using 2x4s as schach. Not that this is the appropriate thing to do, and there's discussion about it. But let's just say that it's acceptable to use 2x4s for schach. Now, we will come to a Mishnah later that talks about a measurement of the 2x, maybe a 2x12s, a 2x8s. That might be a problem, but hey, whatever. It does become problematic at some point. But let's say you're just using a 2x4. There's room to say that it's okay. So let's say you use 2x4s for your schach. So you do have space in between each 2x4. If you're not, you don't have so many 2x4s that you would want to stand on. Again, and your walls obviously are stronger walls than the typical sukkah walls that we build today. But that would be a case where you have a sukkah under a sukkah, and the top one is theoretically usable. It's it would seem possible. Again, I'm not saying that this is a kosher thing to do or it's smart to do. We'll have to see what Shulchan Aruch says about it as well in these scenarios. But it does sound like an interesting option if a person does live in an area like Manhattan, where you can hardly get a sukkah there. It's like a big miracle to be able to eat in a sukkah in Manhattan. It's like, because where do you build it on your, even your fire escape? Yeah, but even there, generally there's a house above it, and there's a fire escape landing above it. So if your landing is here and there's a landing above it, you ruin your landing is also ruined. So it creates definitely as there are issues in these type of areas. So this sounds like an interesting way of getting around that. If it could be done, if it could be done. So we'll have to see in Shulchan Aruch how that works. But anyway, that was just trying to make it a little practical. So based on Moshe's question, maybe that would be a example. Again, I'm just thinking that possibly that could work. The Gemara is really just I guess just telling us the halachim. Maybe it's not so practical. It's just that it's important to know that this is the halacha. Okay, so
But there's a park in Israel that, I don't know whether it's just for during Sukkot that they open this, but they have all these different examples of Sukkot that are mentioned in the Gemara. That you can actually go and visit. I remember it 25 years ago, going and seeing these things. So it's very interesting, see the practical side of what you read in the Gemara. I don't know if it still exists, but I remember seeing it.
Well, what it reminds me of, what you're saying is there is a claim that the Vilna Gaon came up with every single sukkah that the Gemara talks about. Not only the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, but also the Yerushalmi, and he added them all together, and he found some gematria, and he wrote, like someone supposedly there's a sefer that someone wrote from Eretz Yisrael about all the different sukkahs that the Vilna Gaon was relying on. Like these are all the kosher sukkahs that it mentions everywhere in the Gemara. And it came out, I don't know if it was gematria of schach or there was some gematria that he relied on. Anyway, so someone tried to figure out every single one of them. Anyway, so there's some sefer out there that has them. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, there's an acapellas Miros album that on the cover it shows the group having their Shabbos meal on a fire escape.
Right. So okay, so getting back to our Gemara, so we have these. The second case was where the Gemara said the bottom one. One second. The first case was both are kosher. Then we had both puzzle. Then we had the third case where the bottom one is kosher, the top one is puzzle, and that we explained that it's the bottom one was kosher, the top one is puzzle because the top one has doesn't have enough shade for schach, and it was within 20 amos, which would basically make it that it's that it's not schach pasul. It's not invalid schach, it's kosher schach. And according to the way Rashi and Taisus were learning, you're actually using that to validate your bottom sukkah. And ultimately, your bottom sukkah is kosher, the top sukkah is going to be invalid. And then we have the opposite case. Sometimes you'll have the top one kosher and the bottom one pasul. Dummy, how could that be? And this was the case of our Mishnah, where the Mishnah said that yonik sheira tachtain psula. That the top one is kosher and the bottom one is pasul. Hey, Dummy, how's that? The tarvayu tzilsan meruba mechamas, and both of them have enough shade. But kaimal yonim b'seichesrim, and the top one is within 20 amis. So the bottom sukkah has a problem because it is a sukkah tachas hasukkah. It is a sukkah under another sukkah, and the top one is going to be a kosher sukkah because it's within 20 amis, and that will be considered a kosher sukkah. Umar says, okay, you've given 4 cases, but pshita, each of these cases seem to be pretty obvious that should be the halacha. And why did you have to tell us all of these? We know that any sukkah that has more sunlight than shade is going to be invalid. And any sukkah that's more shade than sunlight is going to be valid. And any sukkah that's above 20 amis is going to be invalid. And if it's within 20 amis, it should be valid. So, if sukkah under a kosher sukkah is going to be invalid. So the Gemara answers, it needed to tell us this case where the bottom one would be kosher and the top one would be invalid. That's the case that he really needed to tell us. And that's the real unique case, because that's the case that sounds like a real, it sounds like a sukkah under a sukkah. But the thing is, the way we explained it, it's not a sukkah under a sukkah because the top one didn't have enough schach. But so according to that, so why is this case really such a chiddush? What's so unique and innovative about this law? So the Gemara answers, because Mahu Detema, similar to the previous Gemara, it says Mahu Detema, you might have said that Nigzar, we should make a Gzera decree. Dilma, maybe. Mitzdarif, schach pasul, b'hadi schach pasher. You could include the schach pasul, that even if the top schach sukkah is above 20 amos, you could maybe include that, say it's going to be kosher with the schach from the bottom sukkah. And Kamash Malan, it comes and lets us hear that you don't make such a gzeira. No, you might think that the top sukkah would be above 20 amos, you would also permit it. And the truth is that in that case, the bottom sukkah would be pasul. But you would think that it might be kosher, and so therefore we should make a gzeira even when it's not, when the top sukkah is not 20 amos, above 20 amos, that it should pasul the bottom sukkah also, and the Gemara says Dilma mitzdarv schach pasul b'hadi schach kosher, and you'll think that it's I'm sorry, then you Dilma, maybe you'll think that it's okay, and mitzdarv schach pasul b'hadi schach kosher, that it would be kosher. And Kamash Malan comes and lets us hear that we don't make such a gzeira if the sukkah el yoina, the top sukkah is below 20 amos, so the bottom one will be kosher. Again, the top sukkah also has to be not too much shade, because if it's too much shade, it's also going to make the bottom sukkah a sukkah tachas a sukkah. But as long as the top one has these falls within these 2 qualifications, meaning that it's not too tall, that's not above 20 amos, and it has a schach that's less than shade. In other words, less shade than sunlight. So you have these 2 qualifications that would make the bottom sukkah kosher, and the bottom sukkah you would be allowed to dwell in because it's not called a sukkah under a sukkah. Okay, so now comes this next Gemara, and here the Gemara talks about the 2 sukkahs, one on top of the other, And it mentions how much in between would be considered that it will ruin your bottom sukkah. In other words, how big of a sukkah on top does it have to be? Does it have to fall into the full category of a kosher sukkah, which we've already spoken about, that it is 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths high? You need to have a 10 handbreadths high in order to be a kosher sukkah. Does does that rule apply even to ruin a bottom sukkah, that it needs to have 10 handbreadths on the top sukkah to make it a sukkah? Or is it enough to be like an oihel, maybe a tent, or maybe there's another rule? So what are the rules of the of the height of this sukkah that's on top? Does it, to ruin the bottom sukkah, how high does it have to be? So kama yebein sukkah l'sukkah, how much does it need to be in between the two sukkahs? To make the bottom one invalid, to call it a sukkah under a sukkah. And why can't we just call it one schach? It's one schach. Okay, so they're separated. So what would the difference? So the Gemara says, Rav Huna says tefach, that if there's one tefach in between the two schachs, that already is enough to make it considered a sukkah tachas a sukkah, because we find the law by an oil of tumah, which we did touch upon a while back. Shekin matzino bale tumah, we found such a thing with the oil, with the tent by tumah, that the rule is a tefach, goes by a handbreadth. If there's one handbreadth of empty space, that's called an oil, that's considered an oil, and it changes the rules of the tumah of impurity if the tumah stays in that area or it shoots upward. The Tanan, because we learned in a Mishnah and Alais, tefach al tefach, berum tefach. If there is a cubic handbreadth, a tefach by a tefach, a handbreadth by a handbreadth, berum tefach, on the height of the handbreadth, a cubic handbreadth, that there's tumah under it, and let's say there's vessels also under that same that's under that same roof. So you have a roof called an oihel, and there's an empty space of a so the tent, the tent is a tefach by a tefach, and it's a tefach above the tumah. So I shouldn't use the word cubic tefach. I guess that's not really the exact meaning over here, because it's the oihel itself is a tefach. Let's read it again. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, tefach al tefach. You have a tent that is a tefach by a tefach, and in other words, the roof, berum tefach, and it is above the ground, it's above the ground of the tumah tefach, and so there's tumah under it, and so the thing is, mevi es hatumah v'choitzet b'fnei hatumah. So it brings tumah to the other vessels that are under the same oihel, the same tent. And choitzet b'fnei hatumah, if there's something on top of it, it will be tahar, because it separates between the tumah that's above it. Aval pachos berum tefach, but if it's not a whole tefach high, if this tent, if this board is not a size of a handbreadth, it's not a handbreadth above the ground. Aval pachos berum tefach loy mevi v'loy chaitzitz. It doesn't bring the tumah. It doesn't bring the impurity to the vessels that are nearby under the same tent, but it also doesn't interrupt or interpose between the tumah and the vessel that's above it, even though you have some type of a item that's blocking. Nevertheless, the tumah goes and shoots upward, and it's not chaitzitz, it doesn't block it. And meaning the vessel above it will become tummy. The vessel next to it won't become tummy. But what do we see from this whole thing? This is the laws of tumah. But the point that the Gemara is bringing is that what is the size of an oihel? You need to have an empty space of a tefach, of a handbreadth. So here also, regarding the laws of sukkah, the Gemara understands that if you have a sukkah above another sukkah, and the sukkah on top is only one handbreadth height, it would actually invalidate your bottom sukkah. This is according to the opinion of Rav Huna, and we'll soon see two other opinions tomorrow, Mr. Shem. I'm going to stop here. Zay Gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
I
Rabbi.
get-
Shabbat
Good day,
shalom.
everybody.
Thank you.